So the goal now is to set up our own two-way bindable property in one of our own components. And for that, I created a brand new project. You find it attached. And it's a very simple project with a very simple app component where I'm outputting some inputs here to allow the user to enter some width and height value, and where I then have one custom component, this rect component, which outputs a rectangle. And currently the width and height of that rectangle are set with those dynamic style bindings, but they are set to hard-coded values, and that will change over the next minutes. There also is an onReset method here, which currently isn't doing anything, because it's now in this component where I want to make the size of this rectangle two-way bindable, so that we can pass new width values into this rect component from outside it, so from inside the app component to this rect component, but so that we also get notified about changes here in the app component, so that we can update the values that are shown in those inputs, so that the input width and height values are always in sync with the width and height values that are used for the rectangle. Now currently, if you run npm install and you start this development server with npm start, you will see a page that looks something like this. And currently changing the width and height here in these inputs won't have any effect on that rectangle, but that's what we'll work on soon. I also want to highlight that I am already using two-way binding with ngModel here in the app component. And here I'm using it in the way you've seen it many times before. I have some property here. Here I'm not using signals, but I could do. But here I got an object property with a width and height, and I'm binding the width and height in that object with two-way binding. But of course, this is no custom two-way binding. Instead, this is two-way binding with ngModel, as you've seen it many times before. But now we're going to make this rect component two-way bindable. And specifically there, I want to accept some size property that should be two-way bindable. So let's do that. So the goal is to have a size property in this rect component, which should accept values from outside this component. So it should be configurable from outside this component. And typically you would do that with the input decorator or with help of the input function. And that is what I'll do here as well. So I'll turn this size property into an input. I'll also define its type, and here I expect to get an object as a value, which should have a width, which should have a value type of string, and a height, which will also be a string, since these will be the values that are entered into the input fields. Now I also want to make sure that this is always set, so I will set this to be required, and I'll add this exclamation mark here to make it clear to TypeScript that this property will always have a value, even though we don't assign an initial value here. So that is the size I expect to get. And of course, with that size set from outside, we can go to the template of this component and now set the width and height here on this div dynamically by accessing size.width here and combining that with just px to get a pixel value. And then here I'll have size.height. That should set the width and height. Of course, we now must make sure that in app component, we do bind that size property. And for that, we wanna pass this rect size property here as a value for this size property to AppRect. If you do all that and you save that, you should have an application where now this cube here is in the end kind of connected to the app component. And if I change the width here, for example, you see that now the dimensions of this rectangle change with it. So that's good. We got one-way binding now. We're updating the dimensions of this rectangle with help of this input. But now I also want to make sure that when we click this rectangle, we trigger this onReset method here. And in there, I want to reset this rectangle to some fixed dimensions. So I want to change this size and set it to some new dimensions. But this is not how we should do it, because size is just an input. It's not meant to communicate back to the component that passed the input value. Instead, for that, we need that two-way binding I'm talking about. And to set this up with decorators, so with the input decorator being used, we have to add a second property to this rect component and decorate that with the output decorator. Because two-way binding in the end is the combination of input and output. We're accepting value, but we're also updating a value. So we need an output as well as an input. And now what's important is that this output must have a very specific name for Angular to understand that you want to have a two-way bindable property. Because you now must use the same property name as you used for the input, but then add change at the end of it. And this is now not up to you. This output must be named like this for Angular to understand that this input and output belong together and together create a two-way bindable size property. Then you still create an event emitter here and you define the data that will be emitted. And here I plan on emitting an object that has exactly the same shape as the input, because this output is meant to change that input value in the component that created that value and passed it into this component. So in the app component in our case. And therefore then here in onReset, we now must call this size change emit and now emit this new object that should replace the old input value in the component that created it, so in the app component eventually. And therefore here I'll emit an object where width is set to, let's say, 200, if that is the value we want to reset it to, and height is set to 100, both as strings. And now with this very specific syntax, with this combination of input and output, we created a two-way bindable size property. And therefore, back in the app component template, we can now use the two-way binding syntax on size, just as we also used it on ngModel before. Now we can use it on our own property in our own component. And we don't need to change anything else here in this app component template and also not in the app component TypeScript file. Instead, Angular will do all the heavy lifting for us. And therefore with that, if I now save that and I go back, I can still change these input values and you see that this rectangle adjusts, but we can now also click this rectangle and that will then pass data back to the app component, which is reflected here in these input fields and which updates the rectangle. And that is how you can set up custom two-way binding, by combining inputs and outputs and by making sure that you follow this very specific naming pattern. So that's how you can set up custom two-way binding for your own property in your own component with the input and output decorators. But depending on the Angular version you're using, you can actually use an alternative, more modern and simpler syntax. Specifically, you must be using Angular version 17.2 or later. And if you're doing that, you can set up this two-way binding in a way easier way. You still need to create the two-way bindable property in the component that should receive it, so here in the rect component. But then you assign an initial value to that property that's created with help of the model function. And that is a function that must be imported from Angular core, and that's only available if you are using Angular 17.2 or newer. This model function will in the end make this size property two-way bindable, and it saves you the effort of creating separate inputs and outputs. Now you should still let Angular know which kind of data will be handled by model, and you can actually also call a required method on this model here to make sure that some value must be passed for this size property to this component. You of course don't have to make it required, but you can, and since I used required before, I'll also use it here on model. Now with this setup like this, size will be a so-called model signal. So it's a signal in the end, and therefore you can use it in the template like all those signals by executing it like a function to have Angular set up a subscription. So that whenever the value managed by that signal changes, this component's template here will be re-evaluated and updated automatically by Angular. So that's how we must use size in the template now. And we also need to change this code in onReset. Because instead of emitting some event here, you now simply must update this signal like you always update signals by using the set method or by using the update method. Both works. And here I want to use set and set this to a new value where width is 200 and height is 100, for example. And that's all. This will update the signal, and Angular will then automatically be notified about this update in the component that provided the value for the two-way binding. So in the app component. And it doesn't matter whether you're using a signal here or not. You can absolutely use a non-signal value and pass that as a value for this model-based size property, and it will still work fine. Alternatively, you could also be working with a signal here. It doesn't matter. Angular will make sure that it works either way. Well, and therefore with that, if you save that, if you go back and reload, you can still change those dimensions from inside here, as you can see, from inside these input fields. But if you then click on this, it's still also sent back to that app component and it is being reset. So with that, the two-way binding still works as before, but now with even less code, thanks to this modern model function.